Just in prep for our next bit here, I did just copy and paste the exact same code, exact same controls over into the doctor's controller and the on the doctor create view, right? So here we have the working. I can go back to all provinces, or I can go to wherever I want, BC, Ontario, etc. Right? Okay, so it's no different. It's exact. I didn't do any changes. I just put them here as well, just so you're aware. Okay, now let's go on. So we have that other issue, right, that we talked about, making our refresh drop-down list more reusable so we don't have all the same large amount of code going on every page. So we can make it more reusable, more succinct, etc. Right? Okay. As I say there, when I first wrote that code, I actually pulled it together from multiple parts and wrote some glue to hold it together. Basically, what I had in mind was for it to be reusable and flexible, but I was still thinking about one scenario, and that was with our modal pop-up. You add a new item to the list. You just want to refresh that one drop-down list. So I did set it up so you just passed two pieces of information, really, the basis of the URL, the controller, and the action, right? And then we built it inside the code itself. So to see that, let me actually bring up I actually have it here, right? So we would just pass in this URI was just the controller slash action. And then we would finish building it and once we got the selected option from the DLL file so we could put it back in case they already had an option selected and so on, right? So that's the biggest problem is we were building the URL inside here and it meant we couldn't have much flexibility in the calling code to do what we wanted, right? So the first thing I would do then is, instead of doing that, we'll just make this the URL, the fully formed URL, because after all, in certain circumstances, we might have multiple pieces of information to pass for filtering on. We might have a date range as well as categories or whatever, right? And in that case, you can build with query string parameters, everything you might need into a single URL and just pass it in. Okay, there we go. So I'm just going to put in all the code and we'll talk about some of the changes, but that was the most basic and important one. The other thing was that I really kind of liked the way in that newer code that I put together there, the way we handled the situation if no data was returned. I didn't build that into my first version of refreshDDL because there was always going to be data returned, right? And so it wasn't going to be an issue. So here what I've done is a couple things. I've added as well. So we give the full URL, right? I give an option, a new one here, to show the no data message, right? And then if I want to, I can pass in the message to display. That way I can customize it and say, oh, no cities in the province, or whatever the case may be, right? We have our original add default and default text and fade in and out that were there already. But I have changed how these texts, these messages are handled a little bit as well in this code, in the newer version. But let me first of all focus on, so there was our if to see if we got data back, okay, from our call to our URL, our fully formed URL we pass in, right? So we've added an else branch. So if there's no data, right, well then I check, do we want to give a show data message? If not, then we don't even replace, right? We leave the original data there and we don't touch it. But if we do ask for that, then we empty it out, and then I'm even putting in a test here to see if we actually have a custom message to display. If not, then I'll just go with no matching data, right? And we append that with either the custom message or our stock or default message, right? So those are the only real changes. So it's not a substantial one. The main difference is we pass the fully formed URL. So coming back to our privacy or our create page, right? It does simplify this code quite a bit. Essentially, all we have to do then is, well, we're going to call our refresh DDL. So yeah, we still want to respond to the change event of our province drop-down list. We do need to grab the value of the selected province, right? That's for sure. But we don't need this, and we don't need to empty the drop-down list because we're going to do that in our method, right? We do need to build the full URL. So it just so happens that this is doing that already, right? Because all we need in our case is the ID of the province that we want to filter the cities on, okay? So essentially though, everything from here down to there, boom, gone, right? and we just put our call to our refresh drop-down list, okay? We pass that URL. City ID is the ID of the drop-down or select control we want to refresh. And true, remember, we have a bit of help here that helps us show no data message, right? So that means it will empty it out and show a message if there's no data returned. I could optionally provide my own custom one, but I don't have to. I can just take the default that's there. Now, the only thing with this is, of course, we're calling refreshDDL. So we have to include that, right? Don't forget this step. Otherwise, it'll be giving you an error and it doesn't actually seem to work. Well, it doesn't actually give you an error, but if you set a breakpoint, you'll see that it doesn't work. So we actually have to include the script so that we can actually use it. All right, but that is much more succinct, I think you would agree. So it's going to be exactly the same over here in my create where I put the same code in right at the bottom. Okay, so once more, I'll leave the province ID. Don't need this or that. We do need our URL, and we replace this function with the call to our refresh. And last but not least, okay, don't forget to add the refresh dropdown with script itself. There we go. So that should work now, and you see how much more clean that is. The only thing I should mention as well is, of course, I already had 2 places in my project calling the old version. And because I have rearranged the approach or changed the approach, even rearranged some parameters, those will now be broken. So I do need to fix them. To save time, I've already done it, but I'll show you what I did here. So that was patients, edit, and create. Remember what this was about? This was so that we could have a modal pop-up, right, to add a new doctor on the fly and then come back in and have it refresh, right? So that all happened down here. After our modal was dismissed, we would actually call refresh. So this is one line of code I added because remember, we need to build now the full URL ourselves, right? So I pulled the value from the doctor ID, the currently selected doctor, and we passed that as I added the slashes here to make it a fully formed URL. That's the only change, and basically the same thing on both the edit and the create pages. So now they all use the new version of refresh dropdown list. Okay, so that basically handles, I guess we'll do a demo, make sure it still works, but that handles the whole issue of, uh, first issue of consolidating our code so it's much more succinct. We're reusing that one method much more effectively. And I can see that here if I go to this region, okay, if I go to British Columbia, then I just have the one option, etc. Right? Same with PEI, I think there's only one. If we go to Ontario, we have a few, etc. I can go back to all. And of course, if I go to somewhere that has none, I just get my default no matching data. And you can see how I could easily give a custom message there if I wanted to, right? And it also works exactly the same way if I log in first. And of course, it's going to take me here because I haven't bothered with that, but I'm not going to yet. If I go to doctor create, here it is working exactly the same. There we go. All right. So that finishes. Now we're going to go on to the final issue, actually tying this in. Okay. So we can actually track what city and province was the doctor's medical license first issued. That was our tie in to the rest of the system itself.